From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today from the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen will offer his latest perspectives on the global grain market following the USDA's supply and demand report released this week. Guy will talk about where the U.S. is currently positioned in that market, with the greatest emphasis once again on China's demand for feed grains and oilseeds, and he'll look at what's happening on the world wheat production and export front. Also, K-State's Bill Schapaugh reports that the results of K-State's 2020 Soybean Variety Performance Test are now available to you growers. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton talks about the new garden vegetable varieties which have been deemed All-America selections. All right here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Listening to the Thursday edition of Agriculture Today. Always glad to have you along with us. Well, we've quite a few new numbers to hash over from the USDA's latest World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates, and concentrating on the grain side. We've brought back by, as we do after each of these WASDE reports, Guy Allen. Guy is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, and he's particularly attuned to what's happening internationally with our grain trades. Guy, just to quickly summarize before we dive into the details, though, this report got the market's attention fairly quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, there were actually two reports out on Tuesday. One was the monthly WASDE report. The other one, which was had as much impact on the market as the WASDE, was the quarterly stocks report, which gave us the stock inventories as of December 1st. Usually it comes out a little later after the monthly WASDE, but it had some prizes in it as well, and we've seen that volatility reflected in corn and bean markets particularly as they've reached new highs. And from an economist point of view, we're putting in a lot of overtime crunching these numbers and trying to figure out exactly what they mean or if they're even correct or not.
We will dwell largely on the international numbers and what's happening worldwide as we talk here, but we do need to give a nod to those domestic numbers first. Let's begin with corn, and that's the market that reacted most strongly to the numbers because U.S. production figures for this past cropping season were scaled back noticeably.
Yes, they did come back. They were surprising enough. The market was locked up, limit 25 cents trading on Tuesday for most of the time after the report was released. It was locked up limit, I believe, for the first 3 months at the end of that trading session, and they continued their volatility here through the rest of the week. Just drilling down on corn a bit. The biggest change was nearly a 4 bushel per acre reduction in the corn yield, which took 562 million bushels off the U.S. Corn crop size. That dropped ending stocks to increasingly tight level. That's what really sparked that market.
Did this report share any word on corn exports out of the U.S. likewise?
Yeah, the export numbers were still quite strong. At the moment, the market prices are trying to ration that demand, but we saw the USDA increase China exports by 1 million metric tons up to 17.5 million, and that's for total world corn imports, which we already have nearly 17 million tons of corn on the books to China. In total, though, the USDA did lower the export forecast by 100 million bushels, but I don't know if that's actually going to be reality. You would think with the higher prices we should see some rationing there, but with some things happening in other countries limiting their exports, the U.S. is basically the last supplier of corn through the rest of this marketing year till that southern hemisphere crop comes on board. The December corn stocks number for December 1 from the stocks report came in at 11.32 billion bushels, reflecting a bit stronger disappearance in use during that first quarter. And it was 566 million bushels short of what the average trade guess was, which was a pretty big number. It basically showed record first quarter feeding and residual disappearance, which typically that first quarter of the season is the biggest number. But we've taken that stocks-to-use ratio down to 11.5% from last month to 10.6% this month, which that's getting down to levels which is pretty tight, and it's that sort of relationship that's really prompted that limit move in corn and continue bullishness as we move forward through the week.
A little later, we'll speak further to the interest in China in importing U.S. corn and their meat consumption levels in particular as we get into the international side. Guy, you do have some notes on what the USDA said in as far as grain sorghum production and numbers here in the U.S. Was there anything out there that jumped off the page?
Sorghum was probably a little more optimistic in its production outlook than corn. Not really in surprises there, but harvested area was up 100,000 acres. Yield was lowered about 1 bushel per acre on the grain sorghum to about 73.2 bushels per acre. That gave us a production number of 373 million bushels. That was 2 million bushels larger at the end of the day. So while corn was quite supportive, sorghum year was a bit better, and I think that was probably a bit reflective of the season on that. Feed and residual numbers were unchanged, and no surprise that food, seed, and industrial use, predominantly ethanol, demand was lowered to 15 million bushels compared to 75 million bushels, as that export market is what's really driving sorghum. I'd suggest pretty much every cracker of sorghum is going to export today, and your ethanol guys are definitely pricing corn in there to their grind as opposed to grain sorghum. Exports were increased 15 million bushels to about 290. That's compared to 204 last year. Again, reflecting that strong demand in exports, and that's pretty much coming from China. We can talk about that a bit when we get to the international situation, but sorghum is still very competitive into China when compared to the price of corn.
What about the soybean trade and the immediate market reaction, nearly as dramatic as it was for corn? What were the numbers of significance there, Guy?
Well, it started off with beans. Again, the USDA took the production number down 20 million bushels below the trade average and 35 million bushels below the December number. Now, I think to a lot of growers across Kansas and across the grain belt, that really won't be a surprise. I think they were expecting that, and I think a lot of growers felt that the production numbers that we had been looking at were a bit overstated. Again, this drove the stocks-to-use estimates went from 3.9%, where we saw it in December, which is a very tight number, down to 3.1%. Hence, on Tuesday, we saw a 50-cent rally in the board in soybean prices and continue to see it make new highs as we move through the week.
The point there was that U.S. stocks are critically tight, as you describe it.
Yeah, well, they're tight in the U.S. and they're tight, the other suppliers being Brazil and potentially Argentina. Brazil's effectively run out of beans. As we've noted in our previous discussions, Brazil's actually imported a number of cargoes from the U.S. as well as about a total of 1 million metric tons of soybeans went into Brazil this year, mainly from other South American origination points. Argentina's had some problems with strikes, as well as dry weather down there is lending support to both the Brazil and Argentine production outlook, and again, that's adding fuel to the bullish outlook for soybeans, particularly.
A bullish outlook that may have staying power, perhaps.
Yeah, we've reached a level here, particularly with soybeans, that these ending stocks are critically tight, not only for the U.S. but for the world situation. And I really am not sure how much of a price rally we're going to need to start rationing that demand, because we're seeing, good support in the oil complex, good support in the meal complex. We're looking at record crush capacity and crushing volumes so far. So what's going to start pricing that out? Just not quite sure where that's going to come from. The other thing, our biggest buyer of soybeans continues to be China. And with their centralized government and buying, I wouldn't say they're the most economically rational buyer of grain. So price a lot of times has to do a lot more work to shut off that demand. than maybe it would in a completely competitive market situation.
Lastly, before we talk about the international scene, what we can say about the wheat numbers. And wheat's been sort of in the market going along for the ride to a certain extent, but the stocks number there was pared back, was it not?
Yeah, the winter wheat numbers were only slightly bearish, so quite of a contrast to what we saw in corn and wheat. And as you said, it's been a bit of a follower all the way through, and I think will continue to be. The seeding estimates for what came out for the hard red winter wheat crop, it was estimated at 32 million bushels, which was a bit bigger number than what the trade had expected at about 31.4. Soft red winter wheat seedings were up, which is no surprise given the premium we're seeing in that Chicago, the soft red winter wheat market compared to hard red winter wheat. But hard red winter wheat also came in at 22.3, just slightly above expectations of 22.1. Interesting thing on the wheat situation is the protein spreads. Your higher protein wheat is now at a 13 and higher, is basically at a discount to your 12s and 11s. So there's not really a premium for your higher protein wheat in there.
Guy, you say there's something noteworthy here on the spring wheat side.
Yeah, well, it's going to be an interesting spring as we enter the planting season that's coming up with corn and soybeans and grain sorghum strongly competing for planted acres. And spring wheat's going to come into that mix as well. And given the current price levels, look, it strongly favors soybeans. Corn did quite a bit of catch-up this week on that corn to soybean price relationship. We're going to see, I think, quite a heavy sorghum plant as well. New crop values are over $1 premium for grain sorghum over corn. And then spring wheat has to compete in there. And I'd have to say, look, with North Dakota being the biggest spring wheat producing state and a very large soybean producing state, it's going to be quite interesting to see what the planting decisions are by the time we get to planting.
That's a roundup on the domestic numbers from the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report out Tuesday. But after the break, Guy's particular area of interest in the international grain markets and the numbers that have been posted and what they might signify to the grain trades moving forward. Our guest, Guy Allen, senior economist with the IGP Institute here at K-State, and he'll return shortly with us here on Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today returns now, as does our guest featured on this first half of the broadcast, Guy Allen, the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at K-State. And he is digging deeper into the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates for grains, which were released on Tuesday and to which the markets have been reacting the last couple of trading days. To the global scene, Guy, and you keep tabs on a number of things here beyond just our domestic situation with our grain production, our grain supplies. Let's start again with corn or feed grains. What stands out there from the report?
Yeah, well, look, the export market, particularly this year, has been the big driver. It basically provides the baseline for commodity prices. And while the U.S. was the big changes in this last report, there were some important changes in the world situation as well. World ending stocks were down about 4.7 million metric tons, the U.S. being the biggest part of that change. It's 17 million metric tons below last year's number at about 283.8 million metric tons. That's not an exceptionally tight situation, but it is tight. And keep in mind, China holds 2/3 of those ending stocks currently sit in China, and there's a big question mark hanging over what the real volume of that ending stock number in China is.
That's not unusual. We've spoken about that before. Yeah. What about China's appetite for corn, though, given their meat consumption back on the rise? At least that's the report.
Yeah, if you look at the USDA livestock report, they had an interesting focus on recovery in meat consumption projected for the calendar year 2021, and expect that to increase notably. going to be two impacts on that. One, I think that just helps to confirm the demand for both corn and sorghum and feed grains coming out of the U.S. and their imports, as well as their demand for soybeans, which basically goes in the soybean meal into that feed market. We always are been a bit skeptical on the strength of the recovery, particularly in the swine herd, but we've seen growth across the whole livestock complex, both in not only swine, but in poultry, in aquaculture, and in dairy production as the consumer in China switches to some other products. So recovery in that consumption is also welcomed, but also in the wake of that, we're expecting to see a drop in Chinese meat imports next year as well. And the portion of that coming from not only the U.S. but for the rest of the world as well. So it's going to drop probably from about 13% to just over 12%. And I guess running up a bit of a yellow flag over the whole livestock sector. Those imports, if China recovers in its production, its demand for imports, I think, will be a bit questionable, and that could change quite rapidly.
It could be a very important pivot in the markets for sure. As we transition to soybeans, we can also speak to this point, too, on the coarse grains side. That is, all eyes still on what's going on with the South American crop, as they've had their various interferences with their production. What did this report allude to there, Guy?
Well, the Brazilian crop production number was left unchanged at 133 million metric tons, which was a bit of a surprise, I guess, given the dry weather down there. However, they did drop Argentine production by about 2 million metric tons from 50 down to 48, and that's where the central of that dry area has been in Argentina. As I noted earlier, Brazil basically sold out of their crop this year to the point where they're importing about 1 million metric tons net. Some of that supply is actually moving from the U.S. to Brazil to meet their crushing demand. No changes really on the export side of things. Argentina is holding steady at about 7 million metric tons, and Brazil being the big exporter at 85 million metric tons. We have had a bit of a hiccup in the supply chain due to some strikes and other issues in Argentina, but those seem to have been settled. I think there was well over 100 boats lined up to get loaded at the end of that strike about a week ago, and they're rapidly being loaded at the moment.
So how would you generally summarize world soybean and corn stocks currently, given all of that?
Well, as I mentioned, the ending stocks for corn are actually not unreasonably comfortable. Mm-hmm. They're not as tight as the global soybean situation. Ending stocks for beans were down 1.3 million metric tons, near 11 million metric tons. And the global soybean tightness in the situation is very, very tight. Again, the job of the market is to ration some demand. And the U.S. is basically the last supplier of soybeans at the moment until that South American crop comes online. The key point on the soybean situation is going to be the timing of that. The crop was a bit late planted due to the dry weather, so the harvest of that's going to be delayed a little bit later than usual. As a result of that, we've seen some export sales out of the U.S. probably extend a bit later than what we typically would see before the logistics shift to South America. And there's going to be, with the inverse we're seeing in that price relationship, Brazilians have a big incentive to get that new crop to market and to port and on a boat as quickly as possible.
Well, the global wheat trade, let's round this off with that and what the USDA has to say about that and what that means to our wheat producers here as they're, as you noted earlier, waiting to see if this current winter wheat crop is going to weather the dryness in certain parts of the state.
There's some concern in the U.S., which we continue to watch. World production of wheat was only dropped 1 million metric tons, 772.6 million metric tons, which is a record number for wheat. World ending stocks now pegged at 313 million metric tons. That gives us a stocks-to-use ratio of about 41.2%, which is, that wheat situation is quite comfortable. Again, China's a big holder of that ending stocks for wheat, and you always wonder whether it's available. But even if you look at the major exporting countries, the wheat situation's quite comfortable. Australia, they left a bit unchanged. Their exports still looking at 20 million metric tons. That's more than double what they were last year as they were coming out of a dry weather situation. Russian production and exports were increased to 85.3 million metric tons. Their exports were reduced by 1 million metric tons to 39. EU was steady. Exports were increased by 500,000 metric tons, and Ukraine production was left unchanged. Not too many changes there. So pretty much status quo. Wheat's just going to have to compete with corn and soybeans in that complex. Interesting point on wheat. It had been priced, I think still is priced, to a point where imported wheat prices are quite competitive with imported corn prices into China. And so we're seeing quite a bit of domestic wheat in China, as well as imports potentially working into the feed market, which is a bit unusual to see imported wheat that cheap.
Well, in sum, Guy, how would you characterize where the U.S. production sector sits in the global market? There are some opportunities here for sure for our domestic producers.
Yeah, look, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of volatility in the marketplace. It's going to make any types of option strategy a bit expensive, but it's like having a 16-year-old kid learning to drive. Your insurance rates are sky high, but that's when you need the insurance, not when they're cheap. Probably the most interesting thing is going to see these price relationships as we go into spring planting for Northern Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. All these commodities are going to be competing for acreage. We're seeing good demand continue to, particularly coming from the animal sector, continue to drive these markets higher. And one underlying point that I think will get overlooked from time to time, we've seen a 25% increase in the money supply since March. And just, it sort of goes back to what we saw in the global financial crisis, 2007-8, with the quantitative easing. And I think that's the underlying factor that's driving all asset prices, particularly commodities, to a higher level. And I think we're going to see a shift in that demand curve as our currency continues to be devalued. The U.S. dollar index has reached some lower levels, and I think that's going to continue to fall lower as well. So we need to keep an eye on that exchange rate and the macro picture as well.
And just as an added and final thought, included in the macro picture, should producers be watching to some degree our geopolitical developments?
Yeah, that's always an interesting point. We've got a change of government in the U.S., but that doesn't alleviate the tensions, particularly that we're seeing in the South China Sea. We have a number of major buyers, the primary of which is China, but also Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, some major buyers of grains. And I'll throw India in that mix as well. It's a large producer and a large buyer. And I think those geopolitical issues, particularly in that region of the world, are going to continue to tighten up a bit, and I think will have a significant impact on commodity prices.
Well, the dynamics are anything but tranquil heading into this new calendar year 2021, as per the domestic and international grain trades. We'll keep an eye on it. And for this summary of what the USDA had to say on that front, Guy, many thanks to you. We'll talk again next month.
Thank you, Eric.
He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, Guy Allen, reflecting on the USDA's latest World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates for grains, posted earlier this week. We'll return with more for you. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Eric Atkinson with you. Well, as a follow-up to our visit with K-State's Guy Allen just a few moments ago on the USDA's grain reports of 2 days back, the numbers on Kansas crop production 2020, the final figures were posted on Tuesday as well. Corn production in Kansas at 766 million bushels for the year, down 4% from 2019. The yield, 134 bushels per acre. That was up a bushel from the previous year. The acres harvested at 5.72 million, down 5% from 2019. Grain sorghum production at 238 million bushels, up 17% from 2019, with a yield of 85 bushels per acre. That was unchanged from a year earlier. And the harvested acreage at 2.8 million, up 17% from 19. And soybean production in 2020 totaling 190 million bushels, up 2% from the previous year, with a yield of 40.5 bushels. That was down a bushel from a year earlier. And the harvested acreage at 4.7 million acres, up 5% from 2019. Other crops in the report, alfalfa hay production was at 2 million tons, and that was down 21% from a year earlier, with an average yield of 3.7 tons per acre, down 0.3 tons per acre from 2019. And the harvested acres at 540,000, down 14% from the previous year. All other hay production at 3.9 million tons. That was up 3% from the previous year, and the average yield 1.9 tons per acre. Oil sunflower, 76.4 million pounds, up 56%, and non-oil sunflower, 26.1 million pounds. That was up 186% from the previous year. Cotton production, lastly, at 320,000 bales last year, up 14% from the previous year, with a yield of 826 pounds. That was down 64 pounds, but the area harvested was at 186,000, up 35,000 acres from 2019. Well, soybean growers, this word for you that K-State's 2020 Soybean Variety Performance Test report is now out, where you can see for yourself how specific varieties fared this past year at multiple field trial sites around the state. This is always a valuable reference for you, and K-State soybean breeder Bill Schapaugh urges you to make full use of it.
We've reported on 13 tests this year. A good set of trials, irrigated dry land. Two of the tests down at Parsons were double crop. We moved the double crop test this year from over by Pittsburgh to over by Parsons. A little bit better management control for that. We lost a couple locations to the drought. The Reno County test was really under tremendous drought stress, and quite a bit of variation, environmental variation, variability in the field out near Colby. So those tests were dropped, but everything else was really pretty good trials. Yields again above average. We didn't have a record state average soybean yield, but it's projected to be somewhere in the about 44 bushels or so, low 40 bushel range. Still really good yields. That's reflected in these tests. We had about 75 varieties from 11 different companies and programs that participated in the trials this year. So overall, some good trials. We coupled that with evaluation of soybean cyst nematode resistance by 3 different populations by the plant pathology group here at Kansas State University, Tim Todd and Tom Oakley. So that's all in there. Those results, they're either going to be and/or on the website, or they'll be in print in the final publication in the High Plains Journal publication.
K-State's Bill Schapaugh there. Again, the 2020 soybean variety test results are now online at agronomy.ksu.edu, and search for the crop tests there. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu. Also, soon to be available at your local extension office, or, as Bill says, coming out in a printed form in the forthcoming edition of the High Plains Journal very soon. And that takes us right up to this week's Kansas Soybean Update. With that, Greg Akagi. Greg?
Sarah Lancaster is joining us. She chairs the Kansas Soybean Yield and Value Contest. And Sarah, another outstanding contest, but the 2020 Kansas Soybean Yield and Value Contest are out.
We had to do it in a little bit different format because we didn't have the in-person event this year. We did a live stream. We actually were up a little bit on our entries. We had 35 total entries in the yield contest and 18 entries in the value contest. We actually have two sections. We have one that looks at total bushels produced, and then we have one that looks at the value per bushel of those soybeans. The winner for the dryland portion of the yield contest was from District 1B, so that's the extreme northeast corner of the state. And that winner was P&J Farms. They're located in Doniphan County, and their total yield was 96.7 bushels per acre, so very nearly 100 bushels per acre in that dryland yield contest. In the irrigated division, so that's a statewide contest, we don't break that down into geography. The overall winner there was Sam Miller. He had 114.3 bushels per acre. We actually this year, Greg, had two different entries that broke that 100 bushel mark. We had Sam Miller with his 114.3 bushels per acre, which is a new record. And then we also had Prairie Farms GP, and their total yield was 102.3 bushels per acre. So Prairie Farms is from Meade County, and Sam Miller is in Reno County. So we should also talk about the no-till portion of the contest. So No-Till on the Plains is a sponsor of this portion of the contest. The overall top yield produced in a no-till dryland setting was by Brandon Litch of Osage County with 79.5 bushels per acre. So Brandon is in District 4B, which is in east central Kansas. We want to recognize the sponsor of that value contest. That is IGP, is the sponsor of that value contest. And the winners this year were Brooks Farm. They're in Norton County, Kansas, and they actually had a 99.87% premium. So their soybeans would have earned them nearly $1 over the board price because of the high value of that crop. We want to congratulate all of our winners, and we want to just invite farmers to participate again next year. You know, we're kind of increasing the number of entries over last year, and we hope to see that trend continue.
That is Sarah Lancaster, who is the chair of the Kansas Soybean Yield and Value Contest, as she joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Many thanks, Greg, and we'll return after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, this week's horticulture segment. And for you vegetable gardeners, some information of value, we hope anyway. There's something that routinely happens called the All-America Selections for gardening plants, vegetables and ornamentals. Next week, we'll get into the ornamental side, but this year's list of vegetables is what we want to visit about today with Dennis Patton. Dennis is the Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent and one quite familiar with this selection program, and you might outline that program itself before we go any further, Dennis. It's become quite a good resource for learning about new plant materials.
That's correct. The All-America Selection Program has been around for decades. And what it does is it takes mostly seeded varieties from different vendors, different breeders from around the world, and then it puts them out in a network of trial gardens throughout the United States of America. And in fact, at one time here in Olathe, we did some trialing as part of that process. And so then all these amateur professional gardeners then rate how well all these vegetables grew and flowers. Then they compile those results. And the ones that perform best all across the country then earn this distinction of All-America selections. And they also have some now regional winners, some that may not have done quite as well throughout the entire country, but may have done well in a particular growing area. Like if you look at their website, we're in what's called the Heartland region. And there are some other selections out there, but this year 3 varieties made the All-America list, which means they produce yield well throughout the country.
So there are varieties that folks might want to consider from the past as well as the new. And let's talk about these 3 selections that have made All-America status. Can be grown, again, anywhere in the nation, including here in Kansas. One is a shallot. What is it about?
Well, the shallot has the delectable name of creme brulee. Shallots are not what I'd call a very common plant material for our Kansas garden. It's a relative of the onion, garlic. It's a little bit harder to grow, a little bit cooler season, needs better, even moisture. But you're going to find this as a seed, and you're going to be best luck with a shallot if you can start that seed into a transplant like you would a green onion or an onion plant going to the garden, and then planting, and then you would harvest the shallot sometime mid to late summer like an onion. And a shallot, if you're a cook, you know about it. It's really a milder, sweeter flavor onion, probably not quite as harsh or aromatic maybe when you use it in cooking, especially caramelized with it. And it's supposed to have a really good color also instead of just more of a white variety. So that's one. The second one is an acorn squash called Goldilocks, which is a yellow squash. And when you think of acorn squash, you think of those being that dark green color. But this one, when it matures, turns a nice golden yellow on the outside. And of course, with a winter squash, you need cut it open, scoop out the seeds, and then you bake it, microwave it, and it's the flesh inside that you eat. You don't really eat the skin or the peel of that. And the last one that I think a lot of people are going to find interesting is a jalapeno pepper. And I've got to be careful that I say this correctly. It's potopina, and it is a very dwarf, compact jalapeno pepper that can grow in, according to the research, in something maybe as small as a gallon-size container, hanging basket. And the fruit then will, if you let it mature, will turn red, which a lot of times is a little bit sweeter, spicier pepper than the green. But that one would fit for a lot of people with small spaces, patio gardens, and of course, production yield is all supposed to be one of the selection factors, so it should be good producing for us. Being a new variety, these may be hard to find, so you may want to look for some seed sources and start your own plants or transplants instead of relying on your local vendor garden center that have some of these new varieties.
And by the way, there are write-ups on each of those three, the shallot, the potted pepper, and the squash, in the most recent K-State Horticulture newsletter. If you'd like more detail, simply go to that newsletter, search for it online. But that's just a sampling of the many All-America selections that folks can consider, not only from this year, but from years past. And you would suggest that folks be adventurous here with certain restraints, Dennis?
Well, here's my take on it. I would always make sure the backbone of your garden planting are those good recommended varieties. We know no matter whether it's a drought year, whether it's a cool year, wet year, dry year, it's going to perform well in Kansas. But I also think part of the fun of gardening is to experiment and try new things. So, maybe don't go whole hog and put your whole eggs in one basket, so to speak. Put a couple different varieties out there and try it. Make sure it does work for our area and climate in Kansas. Yeah, like I said, I love spicy food, so I always plant jalapeno peppers in my garden, but I could see putting some of these potopinos in a container on my patio so I can just run out and grab one real quick to put in a dish instead of have to go far out to the garden to pick one for an evening meal.
Very well. And to follow up quickly on something that you alluded to earlier, in regard to all vegetable plant material, that may be, you say, in general, in tight supply. So folks need to be maybe a little more aggressive and assertive in securing whatever vegetable seed stock they are going to plant.
Yeah, last year with the pandemic breaking in the spring, a lot of people turned to gardening. And I know when I went to the garden store to buy my tomato transplants, the shelves were bare. And we're getting reports that this year, it's going to be the same way. The interest, the demand in gardening is going to be high. It takes years to build up a seed source, a seed supply. They were in short supply last year. Reports are they're going to be in short supply again this year. So if you do know there's a particular variety you want, I would get online, get out your garden catalog, go to the store, start, squirreling those away now, so to speak. Or a lot of times, maybe this year when the transplants come on the market, you might want to be the early bird, maybe get them, maybe a little early and hold them and then plant them at the right time as we move into the gardening season here. Oh my gosh, in 2 months, we'll be up to mid-March and it'll be potato planting time.
It'll be here again sooner than
here
you know.
Again.
And lastly, if one would like to find out more in general about the All-America selections, there's surely a website that contains all of that information, in particular for the Heartland-rated varieties.
Correct. If you just Google All-America selections, they'll come up. They have a very nice searchable website based on whether they're flowers, herbs, vegetables, and then you can break it down by regions. And of course, K-State, I can never tout our garden guide, Kansas Garden Guide, enough. That just to me is the Bible for vegetable gardening here in Kansas. And that's available to your local extension office. You can download it off the web.
Very well. Dennis, thanks as always. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Glad to be with you today.
He is Dennis Patton, Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent, on this week's Horticulture segment. That's our Thursday edition. Thanks to you for joining us, and please be back with us right here tomorrow, won't you? Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.